Welcome and good afternoon. Welcome to this sectoral forum on digital infrastructure towards resilient data center transition. Within the past few decades, digital infrastructure as a lifeline system has seen significant growth, making digital services more accessible for governments, businesses, and individuals. Data centers have played a pivotal role in enabling this digital environment. Given the rising trends of both acute and chronic physical, climate, and disaster risks such as hurricanes, floods, wildfires, earthquakes, etc., the ability of data centers to stay operational under all circumstances is challenged. In the context of the resilient data center transition, this session will focus on emergent disaster and climate change risks, measures to improve resilience due to increased interconnectedness, user-centric performance-based guarantees, collaboration actions for cross-sectoral multi-stakeholder initiatives. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Ms. Emma Fryer. She's a partner in the Environmental Resource Management Organization. Emma Fryer joined ERM as a partner in April 2022. Between 2011 and 22, she led the data center program for technology sector trade body Tech UK, representing the interests of operators to government and other stakeholders. While at Tech UK, Emma influenced policy, mitigated compliance burdens, alerted the sector to risks and managed specialist groups, including the UK Council of Data Center Operations. She also negotiated a climate change agreement for the sector in 2014 worth £200 million to UK operators. Over to Ms. Fryer.
Thank you so much. Hello, and from me, a very warm welcome to Sectoral Forum 1, Digital Infrastructure Towards Resilient Data Centers Transition. Yes, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I recently was at Tech UK, where for many years I provided a collective voice for UK data center operators, and I reported regularly to our government on how the sector was addressing climate change risks. Now I'm over the fence at ERM, where actually I'll be working more on the practical side to help businesses anticipate and address those risks. In today's session, we have an absolutely expert panel who will discuss risks and challenges and exchange information on best practice in terms of disaster resilience within this critically important sector. The key themes we're going to look at are the rapid technology development in and around this sector, in particular our relationship with energy infrastructure. We're going to look at interdependencies, and we're going to look at the need for close intersectoral and international cooperation. We'll hear about what we've learned from recent studies and how we can share best practice. I'll introduce our panelists shortly, but first we're absolutely delighted and honoured to welcome Shri Ashwini Vashnar, Minister for Railways, Communications, Electronics and Information Technology from the Government of India, who has very kindly agreed to give the opening keynote to our session. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. We're very much looking forward to hearing about the Government of India's vision on disaster resilient digital infrastructure and how we can strengthen the capacity of data centres in particular to physical risks from disasters and climate change. So Minister, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Esteemed dignitaries, guests from partner countries representing national disaster risk management agencies, participants from the UN agencies, World Bank, academia, research institutions, think tanks, ladies and gentlemen present here and those who are attending virtually, I wish you all a very warm welcome to this session. For me, it's an honor to be present here at the Sectoral Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, ICDRI 2022. We are aware that all over the world, climate change is a very big phenomenon. And especially in the developing countries, the disruptions can be very, very expensive, very costly. When infrastructure fails, it undermines businesses, it undermines job creation, the delivery of public services, and everybody is affected. And the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, they are the ones who are affected the most. So that's why it's even more important for us in the developing countries and to make sure that the people at the bottom continue to get the services despite any climate change adverse impact. Some estimates, especially by the World Bank, I'm told, have estimated that disruption to infrastructure costs the low and middle income countries in the order of about 380 to 390 billion US dollars a year. That's a huge amount. that's a humongous amount. That much amount, if it is put in creating more infrastructure, it can bring transformational changes in people's lives. And the recent pandemic, that has also shown that we have to rethink our strategies, we have to rethink our organizations, and make sure that the infrastructure that is getting created is disaster resilient. It is addressing the climate change challenges that we are all facing. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi ji, India has witnessed a huge exponential increase in data usage, in internet coverage, in public digital platforms, in delivery of public services through digital means. It's a total transformational change. I'm sure all of you are aware of the UPI, the Unified Payment Interface. It's an open platform through which trillions of rupees of transactions are happening today. And a person who is not even school educated, high school educated, even that person is able to use the digital platform in a very seamless manner. The story unfolds into various sectors, whether it is healthcare, whether it is education, whether it is agriculture, it is logistics, transportation. Each and every sector is witnessing a digital transformation. Under these circumstances, when the data-driven economy is taking a primary role in our overall economy and in the lives of each and every citizen, it becomes very, very imperative that we look at disaster resilient infrastructure in a very big way. My request to the participants is that please give your suggestions, and we would be very open to listening and taking the suggestions and then implementing those. Please, if you can, try to give specific suggestions on 4 pillars. The first pillar is organizational front. What are the changes that we need to make our organizations, change our organizations, make them more tuned towards disaster resilient designs? Second is on the technical sides. There are various technologies which are available today which can help the infrastructure to be disaster resilient. For example, the way redundancies are done, the way local cash is available. So that kind of technologies, if we can improve more, so please give your suggestions around that. Third is about the process related changes. Please share your experience about processes which can be reformed, which can be amended, so that the infrastructure becomes more disaster resilient. Fourth is about the awareness. If the awareness increases, people start in each and every aspect, whether it is a password, keeping a good password, to switching off the power at the right time and making sure that the basic hygiene is always cared for. If we consider these awareness factors, then it can become a very important tool in the journey towards creating a very disaster resilient infrastructure. I thank you all for having me in this conference, and I look forward to listening to your suggestions and look forward to implementing those in the policy front. So once again, wishing you all a very good conference. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us today and for outlining such an ambitious and comprehensive vision, recognising as well the strategic importance of digital infrastructure and how to safeguard it, and also everyone who depends upon it. And I was particularly struck by your note and recognition that these impacts are going to be very unequally imposed, particularly with those at the bottom, least able to cope and most likely to suffer the worst consequences, and for demonstrating that leadership and clear thinking in such a complex and problematic landscape. And I think this has set the scene perfectly for our panel to start exploring these issues in more detail. I've noted your 4 points: organizational, technical solutions, process-related changes, and awareness. So just pinning those down to our mental notice boards. So thank you again. And now I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. So we have Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed, who's Vice President, Global Service Management at the Uptime Institute. I think we've all heard of Uptime, and I know we shared a platform last time. We have Ms. Zoe Hamilton, Senior Insights Manager, Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation at GSMA, which is Global System for Mobile Communications Association. We have Mr. Rajendra Singh, Senior Digital Development Specialist from the World Bank Group. We have Mr. Jacques Flouet, Director, Data Center Program at the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA. And we have Mr. Michael Winterson, who's the Chair of the European Data Center Association and also Vice President, Business Development, EMEA, Managing Director, Equinix Services, so working for an operator. So I think this session is now going to explore how data centers can improve resilience to physical risks from disasters and climate change. Our context, as we've already seen, is escalating risk on the one hand, especially from climate change, rapidly increasing dependence on digital infrastructures and data centers on the other for every aspect of our daily lives. And thirdly, major changes in supporting technologies and infrastructures, for instance, in areas like energy supply, as I mentioned earlier. This all sounds like a perfect storm. So let's see how our panel of experts address this combination of challenges. Just to mention, the session's actually divided into four mini sections, and each will focus on a different aspect of the topic. Firstly, we'll look at good practice. In the second session, we'll explore the way that changes in infrastructure systems are changing the nature of those risks. The third section is going to explore issues presented by interdependencies and interconnectedness and how cooperation and information exchange can address those existing and emergent risks. And then the final part will look at scope for government action and international collaboration. We'll have a Q&A at the end if we've got time. So I would encourage people to submit questions if you have them at any time. Don't wait for the end, just pop them into the chat. So now I'm going to start by asking Mr. Michael Winterson to present to us on what good looks like, to share good practices and initiatives that are helping to improve the resilience of data centers to physical disasters and climate change risks within the EU. So over to you, Michael.
Emma, thank you. And please forgive me, I'm dialing in with the phone because unfortunately, the Wi-Fi where I am is not that great. And so one of the key elements about resilience is always having a backup plan. And as someone in the data center industry, we've always focused on that as a key issue. What's the backup plan? I had some presentation material. It might be worthwhile bringing it up if that's possible. If not, I can walk through specifically what we're doing as operators and trade associations to address the issues of sustainability and of resilience. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So what have we done? What we've realized as businesses, so I work for Equinix, is we've realized that we need to be able to provide a resilient solution to our customers. And we do it all independently through things like Tier 3 data center classifications, N+1 architectures, always having a backup power supply, et cetera. Nonetheless, this creates what was in the past a relatively inefficient industry. And we spent a good 20 years building up on that efficiency and building our relationships with our trade associations, such as the European Data Center Association or Tech UK or others, where we focused on what are the issues that we can do to minimize our climate impact. However, in Europe, very specifically in 2019, the European Commission put out two very bold continent-wide documents, the European Green Deal, which commits Europe to being climate neutral by 2050 to avoid the problems of climate change, and Europe Fit for the Digital Age, which fundamentally says we can't get to a green continent unless we digitize every aspect of our service economy. We took that as an industry body and we gave the power to our trade associations to help us work together. Sustainability was no longer a competitive differentiator. Sustainability is a society prerogative. We must deal with the issue of sustainability, and we must deal with it together as a set of operators. And we set ourselves 5 targets that we in Europe would achieve. And those targets are an efficiency metric for our industry that constantly improves over time, a commitment to using 100% renewable energy by 2030, a commitment to set and continually reduce the amount of water we consume because water is becoming a scarce resource in Europe, and a commitment to start supporting a reuse and refurbishment economy, both in the terms of electronic equipment and in the terms of the waste heat that our data centers generate. So we're building this program up, but we realized that we can't, as a single group of operators, solve this problem by ourselves, especially when it comes to resiliency. And that's where we've engaged the European Commission on a whole of system policy concept, where operators, trade associations, and government bodies work together to improve the resilience and the sustainability of our industry as we help other industries digitize and do the same. If we go to the next slide, please. So I guess this is where I would like to focus. In the future, to build a resilient power and digital infrastructure, we need to work with policy on smart energy grids that data centers can tap into and potentially help support. So where are we today? All of our data centers can operate independently. All of us use diesel generator backup power. All of us have N+1 independent data center factories. In the future, 100% renewable power commitment creates problems. Supply is going to vary depending upon the weather. The electricity grid is being pressurized as we electrify more things, such as transportation. There's lack of capacitance on the grid as we take away traditional petroleum and coal-based power, which uses turbines. It creates a natural capacitance on the grid. When you remove that and replace it with solar panels and wind power, that capacitance disappears and the grid becomes inherently less stable. What we feel is that with the data center capacity that we've built up, we need to start looking at a smart electricity grid where we can take ourselves off the grid or provide capacitance back to the grid to help support it and keep it vibrant. But we need government to start investing in energy storage systems, with the biggest one of them all potentially being a green hydrogen revolution. And that's our biggest push, is for government to start using excess renewable energy to create green hydrogen, which then can be used as a secondary power source. The most important part of that is that if we do that, we as an industry can become more resilient. Instead of having primary backup power, we can now start using both the electricity grid and a green gas grid as two active energy sources, where we can take from the energy grid that is most capable of dealing with our requirements at that time and remove ourselves from the grid that is weakest at that point in time. As such, we become part of the solution to creating a more resilient infrastructure in the future. I think that's really it. And I just wanted to give everybody an idea that effectively, without trade associations representing operators to government, we will never be able to create a systemic whole of system change that needs to happen for both sustainability and resilience.
Thank you so much, Michael. And that's true. That's a real demonstration of how collaboration and cooperation can actually make things move forward, and talk to government at a collective level has always been much more effective than lots of voices independently. I think this sets the scene absolutely perfectly to move us into the second section of this session. We're going to look at emergent disaster and climate change risks as a result of changes in infrastructure systems. And as Michael mentioned, the adoption of newer technologies and sources of renewable energies can in some circumstances lead to unforeseen or emergent physical risks. These might require new approaches and metrics to improve resilience, or changes to existing approaches. On a connected note, I found the uptime surveys of data center resilience and attitudes to resilience extremely useful as a reference point when I was submitting and compiling our reports to UK government on data center preparedness for climate change risks. So obviously I'm delighted that Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed from Uptime Institute is here. Mohammed, I was hoping very much that you might be able to comment on these current and emerging risks as a foil to what Michael's just said in particular, and how they're posed to data centers, particularly relating to these infrastructure changes, and also obviously the sustainability drivers, and whether, you know, what the quid pro quo is in terms of how they position us. Also, perhaps you could look at explore some of the challenges you might anticipate in terms of maintaining grid stability and capacity in the context of escalating risk? So that's a rather vague question, I'm sorry, but I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Emma. I would like to draw our attention back to the last year's event before commenting on this question, that the risk that we identified and discussed in last year's our session was quite different from the risks that we are addressing today. So that shows that data center industry is quickly progressing. It is entering into new eras, new challenges, much faster than anticipated. Last year, most of the risk was associated with the climate change disasters such as earthquakes, flooding, heavy rains, transportation risk, access to the critical sites, and inability of operators and data center owners to transport materials, consumables, and human resources to physical sites. So most of the discussions were around that. Now, fast forward 2022, we're discussing entirely something different. And those risks. So what we need to do is to keep updating our logs of risks that's every year are appearing on the canvas of data centers. And as we are progressing fast and we are progressing further into data center physical infrastructure and adopting new technologies in order to comply with sustainability and in order to comply with the carbon neutrality, we will be using technologies and processes and systems that has not been tested and verified over a longer period of time. And those poses additional risks to the digital infrastructure. Uptime Institute is advising, educating from last 25 years about resiliency and availability of data centers. One of our key focus is to keep a balance between different demanding requirements within data center space. And not all the requirements, not all the pressures on the data center operators are aligned. There are many competing requirements, and those requirements, for example, increasing efficiency or improving PUE or improving sustainability for a data center might not be aligned with the resiliency requirements of data center, availability requirement of the data centers. And those might reduce the availability, can impact the resiliency of the data center negatively. What Michael has suggested has been considered widely into the industry. Most of the organization are talking, and most of the organizations who are into the design, construction, and operation of data centers are thinking about employing hydrogen, green hydrogen for carbon neutrality. And one of the way to achieve is to have either microgrids around data centers, have power plants dedicated for data center campuses that can be fueled from hydrogen, that can be fueled from natural gas, along with the other renewable power sources. And those grids are dedicated for the data centers. And if the power requirement is not at the maximum, those grids can feed back to the national grid and can serve the communities. The other discussion going on along the industry is to think in terms of energy. So the energy used in data center, the kilowatts used for the IT load is converted into heat. 99.996% of the power used by the IT equipment is converted into heat. And that energy can be reutilized, can be used back to the nearby communities, serving them. So that can be an efficient carbon offset for the energy used into the data center, and that energy can be reused. However, what we need to see here, while implementing these new technologies, these new processes, these new concepts into the industry, we need to be careful understanding that how the data center infrastructure resiliency can always be maintained at the highest level. So while we are getting greener, we are getting more carbon neutral, at the same time, the availability of data center and the digital infrastructure for day-to-day life, for the business processes, business availability, business continuity is not impacted. And I believe these are two cohesive things. They can work together, they can run hand in hand, and these can be achieved all together. We don't need to compromise one over the other, and both can work together. One of the interesting article that I just seen yesterday night was that we need to also look into the geopolitical risks associated with the data center. Yandex data center in Finland was refused power by the national grid, and so it is running with its own generators. So these are other kind of risks. Those are emerging into the data center industry that the data center operators need to work on. Probably a detailed log of the dependent infrastructure for data centers is key for risk mitigation, and each risk associated with the dependent infrastructure need to be considered. There need to be more transparency in collaboration, for example, power grid, water availability, transportation means to be there, and the risk associated in those areas need to be seen, that how far they can impact the primary, secondary, and tertiary infrastructure that can eventually result into disruption in the service. And if all these items are covered, all these segments are covered comprehensively in data center resiliency, these can enable the infrastructure to support business continuity as required.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. And actually, I hadn't spotted that, but you're absolutely right. There's the complete change in focus from the discussion last year is a really material signal of our change in outlook now. So thank you for that. I should have noticed it. And I think you brought across brilliantly that balance between the competing requirements of sustainability, efficiency, and resilience. And I'm very much comforted by the fact that you don't think that has to be a compromise, because obviously, you know, there are all those concerns about the new technologies that haven't had time to be tested, geopolitical risks ever present, and then presumably balanced against just that need for constant vigilance and keeping risk registered fully updated, and always maintaining a full understanding of how to maintain that resiliency. So loads of food for thought there, so thank you very much. So reflecting on that, I wonder, Mr. Rajendra Singh, if I can direct the next question to you, which is really about the kind of changes and updates that might be required to measure disaster and climate risk, and how resilience might be delivered in data centers. Could I ask you that question?
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, CDRI, for giving me this opportunity to be on this panel along with our esteemed colleagues. So when it comes to the measure of disaster and climate risk and resilience, you know, various things which come to my mind, they could be related to technical, policy, regulatory, and legal issues. And Mohammed briefly mentioned about laws. What I would like to say, there are 5 points which, in my opinion, are relevant. Number one is standards and open access to these data repositories which are available and which can be used by various stakeholders. And I believe that, you know, industry is still working on these issues, and there are some gaps which I'm sure can be addressed by experts. The second point is about that, this kind of measurement is not a one-time process. Because unfortunately, what is happening, the climate change and the effect, it is not something which is kind of like one-time process or which can be very well predicted. It can happen anywhere. And therefore, this measurement of risk and resilience is a continuous process. The third point is that this is not, in some cases, this is not confined to one country. It could be of regional nature, and therefore, different associations, as Michael gave the example of European Union, and similarly, there could be, regional entities which are involved, and therefore they have to work on policy and regulatory issues which are of regional nature. The fourth point I wanted to mention that, like from the user's point of view and from the overall industry's point of view, we are in a transition phase. I mean, the industry is moving from private cloud maybe to the public cloud, and therefore the risk assessment factors could be different in these different situations. And finally, my point is that as far as in the World Bank, we do the risk assessment at the project level. But for data center, very site specific and, individual data center specific risk assessment may be necessary to kind of do the proper assessment of the risk and resilience of data center. So I will stop at these 5 points and will be very happy to interact and learn in this session from our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much. And I think I've captured those 5 points. I was taking notes furiously. So we've got the already available standards and a huge amount of data in repositories that people can access. Secondly, the fact this is a continuous process. And I'd also say it's a huge system with multiple variables as well, not confined to one country, but multinational. We've obviously got this transition in industry business models, certainly at point of use, and also your point about the fact that risk assessment, it's not necessarily at project level, there's a lot of site-specific attention needed. So with that in mind, I'm now going to ask Monsieur Jacques Fluet a related question, which is really relating to standards and understanding the emergent risks from the presentations you've heard and comments you've heard. What changes do you think will be required to measure risk and resilience in terms of the standards and the standards environment? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Emma. Today the data center risks are very, I think, well defined. Looking at all the natural elements, natural disasters, and it's all about redundancy, site selection, being able to have a data center that can resist a lot of those factors. But as was mentioned earlier by Mohammed, like geopolitical and all kinds of new risks are happening right now. There were cell sites being burnt in various parts of the world based on the fact that they were afraid of 5G radiations of some sort. There's all kinds of new risks that are happening right now around the world. And we need to be ready for all of those risks. Another thing also that is important is that the data center network is getting more and more distributed. And what I mean by that, we're splitting. It's no longer those huge big data centers that are supporting all those activities and a few of their enterprise. I think right now we're seeing kind of a hierarchy of data centers, from micro data centers very close to the end users to support all the new activities driven by all this data of the digital age. And all of those things forces us not to only choose locations, for example, that are low risk, but also to mitigate the risk where the data center is needed. So that brings a brand new perspective on the industry. And also having all this big infrastructure of redundancy is not necessarily also cost efficient, because that's another aspect of the balance. There's the resiliency, the sustainability, but also the overall efficiency of the investment. And all the data center owners have to balance all of those activities and providing the users with the level of services and the experience on the digital services that they expect. So that forces the industry, especially on the standards, to start looking at, multi-site resiliency rather than single-site resiliency as we typically look at it today. And that's a brand new aspect where the standards organization are starting to look into and see what does it mean for the industry, on top of microgrids and all those big activities that are also very important at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Jacques. So actually, the tradition has been that everything's been very well defined, but it's a bit like everything is a moving target. So the industry itself, with its change in business models, its new distributed nature, is a moving target. We've got the moving target of the risks, and we've got the moving target of sort of landscape issues like geopolitics. So I'm really interested in the alert that standards will be moving to explore multi-site resiliency, because I hadn't heard that before. So that's really interesting. That concludes the second part of our session. And we're now going to move into part 3, which will focus on measures to improve disaster and climate resilience in the context of increased interconnectedness and interdependency. Just before I move on, though, I've been nudged to remind people, if they're asking questions, to put them in the live Q&A box, or at the end of the session, when we're nearing the end of the session, just to ask them directly if you're attending in person. So that's the live Q&A box. I think I might have mentioned a chat box, but it's live Q&A. So let's move on. I'm going to start this session then by inviting Ms. Zoe Hamilton to share via a short presentation some of the good practices followed by the telecommunications industry to build disaster resilience, and what kind of lessons we can apply to promote resilience in data centers and the supporting infrastructure systems. So Zoe, if I can hand over to you, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak on this distinguished panel. I also put some slides together. If those could be shared, that would be great. Just to introduce myself again, I work in the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation team at the GSMA. We look specifically at this question of how to leverage the potential of mobile technology and mobile networks to accelerate the delivery and impact of humanitarian aid. Specifically, as it's relevant today, in the immediate aftermath of a natural hazard, humanitarian responders and affected populations really need access to information to react quickly to changing circumstances and make good decisions. Access to information has been described as being as important as access to food, water, medicine, and shelter. So today we really see the critical importance that mobile network operators and the telecoms industry have in their responsibility not only to protect business interests during times of disaster, but also to facilitate communication around relief efforts and to support both their subscribers and the wider community. The Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation team at the GSMA created something in 2015 called the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter to further this goal. So we created the charter to support MNOs to improve their disaster preparedness, resilience, and coordination with the sector. We currently have 156 operator signatories. And the charter consists of these 3 principles that you see on the slide here, including first, to enhance coordination with and among MNOs before, during, and after a disaster. Second, to scale and standardize preparedness and response activities across the industry to enable a more predictable response. And third, to strengthen partnerships between the industry, government, and the humanitarian sector. So today I thought I would speak a little bit to the telecoms perspective, focusing on increased resilience to reduce loss of life, and share some of the best practices we've seen in the industry based on our engagement through the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I thought once we get to the next slide, I'll share very briefly an overview, here we go, of the number of ways that we've seen the industry increase resilience. And this is throughout the operating model, some of which the panelists have already touched on. But very briefly, business continuity management planning is the operational framework for how a company will respond in the event of a disaster. We've seen MNOs having great success when they spend the time to properly create a business continuity management plan. These are typically divided into 5 stages. First, risk assessment. Second, planning. Third, actioning and building. Fourth, simulating and testing. And fifth, updating. So making sure that this is iterated and kept up to date with risks as they emerge. Second, disaster management teams. As part of this, it's really important to make sure that staff and teams are ready to respond to crisis situations. That means that there are clear roles, chains of authority, communication channels, and as mentioned, simulations and drills to make sure that people are prepared. A part of this resilience is also staff safety, not only to ensure continuity of services and that staff are ready to be resilient, but also to protect the people. So that means communication plans in the event of a disaster to keep in touch with staff, shelter provision, psychosocial support if relevant. And these are all sort of ways to make sure that internally, going back to the minister's four pillars, that organizationally and process-wise, that industry actors are prepared. Next, access and transportation. So in order to maintain infrastructure, it's of critical importance to be able to access key sites to assess damage and repair and replace equipment. To do so, it might be necessary to identify alternative transportation methods and partners ahead of time, or to arrange priority access with the relevant authorities. We found that some operators have had success in working with governments to identify critical network coverage areas ahead of time to arrange this access. And it might also include ensuring that key suppliers have also secured this access. So that might be network equipment or fuel generators. Next, infrastructure. Here, I'm speaking specifically about cell towers. So it's important to ensure structural stability on cell sites, adhering to national and local building standards. Part of the planning process is also, of course, taking into account local geographical risks when selecting tower locations. Turkcell, for example, in Turkey ensures that all network facilities can withstand earthquakes up to 9.0 on the Richter scale because of local risks. Next, core network equipment, including data centers, are vulnerable to both widespread disasters like earthquakes and local disasters like flood and fires. Network congestion can also increase following a disaster as people search for information and try to contact loved ones. So specific risks, for example, can include to fiber, which of course are less prone to disruption, but can be affected by earthquakes, flooding, cyclones, tsunamis, fires, and other natural hazards. Above ground cabling is at higher risk, especially to support and pole failures and breaks from debris and wind. Microwave links can also be affected by high levels of rain or attenuation, and VSAT units can be affected by wind and debris, physical damage to the units. So I'm sure everyone's familiar, but ways of ensuring resiliency of this equipment include regular checks and simulations at the network operation centers to understand how information will be presented, ensuring key sites are identified and redundancy is in place through service duplication and geo-redundancy, creating traffic overload management plans, backhaul resilience through combination of redundant channels, including fiber, microwave, and satellite, distributed networks, large range base stations in key areas, and COWs and instant networks located in key sites. And then finally, power. This has been touched on a lot today already, but obviously commercial power outages can have enormous impacts on MNO's ability to provide connectivity in times of crisis. So having appropriate power backups and sufficient fuel is essential. So ways to ensure connectivity, as already mentioned today, include ensuring resilient alternative power systems are available, pre-positioning fuel for generators near key sites, ensuring supply chains and plans are in place with key stakeholders, classifying priority network bands, and acquiring backup power supplies. I covered a huge amount of information trying to provide a holistic view of the ways that we've seen the telecoms industry improve resilience and the ways that they've worked with various stakeholders, suppliers, and government in particular. And more information can be found in this report that I've put over on the right-hand side, but feel free to get in touch for further information. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and you managed to link nearly all the themes we're actually covering in this session within that short presentation. Fantastic. I noticed you revisited the point about those most badly affected with their immediate need for access to communications being equal in importance to food, water, shelter and sanitation. And I have seen that emerging, certainly in some of the things I've looked at. So really, really important. I was really interested in the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter, how you're scaling and coordinating response activities and the importance there of partnerships and cooperation, which we're going to come on to shortly. And then again, all these best practices and how they're actually manifested as an iterative model in practice. And we hear a lot of that from data center sectors. So that's echoing what we are doing within our own sector. I thought what was really interesting, and we definitely saw this about the issues of accessing key sites or getting pumping equipment to key sites or power. That was a real problem. But you've also introduced interdependency, which I think is something we're going to talk about in a moment in more detail, and the supply side interdependency, as well as interdependency between and within sectors and subsectors, infrastructure sectors. And obviously for data centers, power is a big one, but also connectivity. And yes, we're very, very conscious of our supply side, our dependence on the supply side, and how far down that supply chain you have to go to be confident. But anyway, in terms of intersectoral interdependency, obviously we depend heavily on communications networks in the data center sector and similarly on energy supply, also obviously on transport and water. I'm going to direct my next question to Mr. Naveed Saeed, if that's okay, Mohammed. It's really, how can we avoid these risks that are outside our control? How do we deal with these intersectoral interdependencies in a way that can give us some sense of confidence in looking ahead at managing these risks?
Well, when we are looking risk outside our control in interdependencies, we should be thinking broadly of certain events, how it's going to trigger the overall behavior during that event in that locality, in that geographical location. For example, if there's a disaster that hits a certain geographical location that hosts a data center, we should also be thinking that how the governments and the agencies are gonna prioritize at that time. For example, the people's life, if the disaster is a kind of thing that's going to impact people's lives, so all the resources should be expected to divert saving human lives. If it is related to some key infrastructure such as rail infrastructure, power infrastructure, we should be thinking that all the relevant parties will be trying to maintain, trying to help and support that critical infrastructure. And then we should be thinking that, okay, what are the local arrangements in place within the control of the data center owner and operator and its partners or vendors and suppliers that can help to sustain the data center operations. One of the thought that is hitting my mind comes from some time as the risk logs are increasing and the number of risks are increasing and the frequency is increasing, is that the data center operators, data center customers should also identify the key loads they want to keep, key IT loads they want to keep during those disaster conditions, and those loads can help to cut down some less necessary, some less essential loads, and that can really help the data center operators to keep up for longer period of times with the limited resource availability, limited connectivity, limited fuel supplies, limited power availability, limited water availability, for example. Now, as Michael has presented in the beginning, that most of the data centers, carbon neutrality is one of the things. So we will be looking at. I was in Data Cloud a few weeks back, and there's a huge discussion about turbines that can run on hydrogen fuel 100% without need of mixing them with the natural gas. So we will be seeing that the more infrastructure is going to be built around data centers that can provide hydrogen, green hydrogen, that can provide natural gas, and all those infrastructure will pose more risks to the data center infrastructure as well. And if we look at that, the data center users and data center owners, operators can profile the extremely required workloads, if those can be profiled, and those can be quickly, the operators and users can quickly switch on to that, because these with the software defined workload management, it is quite easy to switch on to those workloads in a very quite shorter period of time. That can enhance the capacity of any physical infrastructure to sustain any risk, any disaster for quite longer period of time. So that is something I believe industry should start working around that for mitigating the risks that are emerging now. Interdependencies definitely requires more investments. For example, if fuel storage is 24-hour fuel storage is thought to be sufficient a couple of years back, probably data center owners and operators will be looking to enhance the fuel storage on site so that they can sustain it for a longer period of time. The additional support can be done that they can have contracts with the fuel suppliers, that in case of a forecast, for example, weather forecast, that's a predictable risk, they could have space in the data center where they can park additional fuel tankers with the fuel filled into that. And if the risk doesn't happen if the weather doesn't went to that extreme, that can be quickly returned back to to the suppliers. One example. The other example is working closely with the network operators, the connectivity operators, that how resilient their sites are, and if a risk is going to hit a geographical location, will their core sites will be impacted by that, and whether or not there is an alternative connectivity from another core site that is geographically located in a different location. So these kind of risk assessments, I believe industry has done a lot on this side, and there's a lot of development on that side. So these can be done, but again, when we are going to increase the dependency, for example, green hydrogen pipeline infrastructure or natural gas pipelines coming to the data centers facility and powering the data center, or the microgrid that is powering those data centers, then we need to increase our risk assessment beyond the physical site location and take into consideration all the critical infrastructure places. Those are the data centers are dependent to operate and to support the business continuity.
Thank you so much. That's a really comprehensive answer, and it's led us on beautifully. So I'm hearing from you, one has to be evidence-based, completely systematic, and review the critical functions so that you can prioritize those key functions and actually essentially shut down non-critical. And also start looking beyond the site in terms of interdependencies like fuel and connectivity. So I'm quite interested in terms of what you say. We know that data centers tend to be very well prepared in terms of fuel. I think they are increasingly looking at weather forecasting. But over to connectivity, I like the idea of the fact that as you identify these new and changing interdependencies, you then have to work more closely with those providers, with network and connectivity operators. So there's that immediate sort of collaboration, but also can we draw lessons from telecommunications operators in terms of managing and improving resilience at the standards level? I mean, how do standards account for interdependencies with other sectors, and can new standards or existing standards take account of those interdependencies and manage them? I wonder if I can ask Jacques again, whether you could comment on that, what role there is for standards in terms of tackling these interdependencies.
Yes, no, the telecommunications sector is doing a lot of work on improving reliability of the network. Like Mohammed mentioned, TIT load. You know, the next generation of networks is introducing all kinds of new functionality. Being a software-defined network, it opens all kinds of new possibilities, like network slicing, to be able to guarantee a minimum service performance for the different types of services. And I think the data center are going to be aligning with those kind of things, because at the end, the service is provided by the data centers. At the end, the telecom is only there as to connect the users and the data centers together. So this is coming, and we've seen in the past that in the wireless networks, everything is overlapping. There's multiple bands, there's multiple sites that can provide the service to a customer, and people are switched from site to site without even noticing it. And I think that's the next generation that is coming. Standards organizations like ETSI is working on the multi-access edge computing, being able to have mobility of the applications, either to follow the users or to in case of problems, being able to move an application from one data center to the next in real time without the users even noticing. So those are still being worked, but this is where the industry is going right now. I think those are important things, and that's where I was going with my multi-data center resiliency, is that you don't necessarily need at the end to have each data center with like 72 hours of backup capacity, as if you can move the workload around to another data center that can provide the similar type of performance. And there's all kinds of new things being done in the telecom industry as well. The 3GPP is working on standards for having low orbiting satellites as base stations, as cell sites pretty much. So if the physical infrastructure on the ground is failing, then you can still potentially connect to the low orbiting satellite and still have service. So that will also have impacts on what does it mean for a data center to have resiliency on the connection side. It might require that you're going to see data centers with satellite communication now. So all of those kind of things are happening, and we'll see what where the industry goes once this thing starts being implemented. But technologically, there's a lot of possibilities that are available and will be available soon.
Wow, thank you so much, Jacques. So we're now moving into part 4 of our session, and the focus is now on governance and collaborative action. So this is all about how we can work together across industries and governments to ensure resilience to risks in the context of all these rapid changes in technologies and infrastructure. How do we foster productive cooperation between all these multiple stakeholders? I wonder, Mr. Rajendra Singh, can you start us off perhaps by suggesting the kind of collaborative actions that are needed to ensure this cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder cooperation for mainstreaming resilience in data centers and the associated infrastructure systems? Would you be able to comment on that for me?
Thank you very much, Emma. Let me make 3 points on this. You know, data is already becoming a fifth factor of production in addition to capital, land, labor, and technology. As far as cross-sector issues are concerned, you know, whether you are in space, in air, on the ground, underground, in the ocean, under ocean, I mean, think of any activity and data is involved there. The point, you know, like look at the kind of interdependence and cross-sector involvement. Say electric vehicle charging, when we are planning the electric vehicle charging station to make sure that the transformers to which these charging stations are connected, they get sufficient cooling time. You need constant feedback from the charging station so that you know, you can switch over the transformers. Smart grid, intelligent transport system, everything is connected to data. Yesterday, I was listening to a very interesting conference here, which is organized by National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. This was about, Antarctic advanced research. And there were various speakers from the industry, from academic institutions and government institutions. And what I noticed that the whole focus was on that they are collecting data from the Antarctic and how to analyze, how to give the feedback, what kind of decision making. The second point, in the World Bank, we are funding various projects which involve data center and telecom connectivity. And what I have noticed in some countries, there is a tendency in the government that different government departments, they want to have their own data center, and sometimes security, privacy, and confidential nature of their business are given the argument. So my point is that somehow we have to stop this mushroom growth of multiple government agencies. They should not have this tendency to have their own data center. My third point, and during the chat, I was seeing that there is a question about early warning of disasters and how data centers can play very important role. There is a very interesting thing which is emerging. The optical fibers, they are crisscrossing under the sea, under the ground, everywhere. And optical fiber is very sensitive. I mean, the losses change in optical fiber if there is a motion or there is a slight bending. Now, any seismic activity, whether it is under the ocean or under the ground, it will result in variation in the losses of the optical fiber system. And our digital signal processing is so advanced that they can capture those variations. And when this whole data by using AI or ML can be processed, it can be very, very helpful in giving early warning system. In fact, there was a very interesting experiment which was conducted in Caltech a few years back. There is a festival of marching bands, and they had put underground optical fiber. And even when marching bands were moving, they could capture the variation in the optical fiber losses. So these are, few points, in my opinion, which can be captured if we have cross-sector and multi-stakeholder cooperation, and if we all work together, irrespective of whether we are working in telecom or in agriculture or in other sectors. So these are the 3 points I'll submit for the consideration of those who are dealing with this disaster and risk management. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I love yes, irrespective of whatever sector data is involved. I expect Michael might also have something to say on the tendency to what we call server hugging, where everyone creates their own little data center and then has to worry about it. I had no idea about the seismic activity being able to be modeled through optical fiber perturbations, and that must be hugely important. I know we can predict weather reasonably well in terms of tropical storms. We know where they form, we know when they form, we can track their process, but seismic is much harder to give decent early warning of. So that does cover off one of the questions. So fascinating. I wanted to actually go back to Mr. Fluid, if again, sorry, I'm working quite hard today, just to ask actually, which is a slightly tangential question to this, is what regulatory mechanisms do you think will be required to safeguard accountability and transparency of service delivery to users? Because after all, it's the users who lose the service. So how do we guarantee that? Is regulatory intervention needed, do you think?
That's a complicated one. Regulatory can help and can as well hinder. So it's a complicated solution. There's a lot of standards existing out there. Multiple providers are developing standards that define resiliency of data center. It's been well known over the years. So I think that's one of the key items. If you build your data centers according to the latest best practices and for the higher levels, like 3 or 4, you pretty much have a fairly resilient data center. Okay, those standards keeps on evolving all the time to take into account the latest technologies and what is important, and also the new demands from the services from the customer. As the society gets more digitalized, a lot of things become more mission critical than it used to be. So all of those things are evolving. Having the data center certified is also extremely important if you want to make sure that what you have, it meets the requirements and also maintains those requirements over time. As we know, data centers keep on evolving with new workloads, new equipment, new customers, and it has to be maintained to keep the same level of resiliency. The extra capacity you had at the beginning might not be extra capacity anymore. So all of this stuff has to be maintained. The users need to have clear understanding also of their own requirements, like what type of services are they gonna put in there? What is the SLA they're expecting? And SLE is no longer an SLE for it's no longer a one size fits all. Okay, there's different types of workload that requires different service level agreement, and that they have to be able to manage that and specify that and get a good agreement with their data center. And also another point that is becoming important in the industry, there's two ways to really provide resiliency. There's the reactive function, meaning that you have a fault, you cut over to your redundancy and everything still works fine. But as was mentioned before, there's a few of those disasters that could be, I think, evaluated, and you have some time to react. Okay, there's weather patterns that are coming. A hurricane, you typically know a few days in advance that it is coming. There's others like earthquake, or you have only at best a few seconds or a few minutes. But there's a lot of other potential disasters where you can have an early warning and be able at this point to say, what do I do during those days to mitigate the risk for the various workloads that I have in the data center? If the workloads are critical, can I move them outside of the path of the hurricane, for example? Or can I duplicate it so that 2 data centers offer the service at the same time? So hopefully the 2 won't go down together. So all of those kind of things need to be implemented. Regulatory is a complex item to be able to go into the subtleties of all of those little concepts. But I think some of the government are requesting certain levels of resiliency for all their own workloads when they move them to the cloud. So this is kind of happening in certain countries, but I haven't seen it right now happening globally.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose I take from that the fact that regulation it covers the necessities, often retrospectively and very slowly and quite clunkily, but standards actually, because they're peer reviewed, they can evolve, they're proactive, they can deal with the best practice end of things. So it's that sort of it's that relationship, and I think that the sector, the data center sector, has a remarkably well advanced array of bespoke standards. So and we're seeing a good coverage within resilience. So I see that as being very encouraging. Zoe, I wanted to come back to you. I've got a question about the what are the various levels where resilience will need to be improved or built to ensure that we have access to connectivity in times of disaster, and whether there are more. I know you've already touched on some of these, but perhaps you go into a bit more detail about the sort of collaborative actions that might need to be further leveraged, perhaps, to ensure continuity of connectivity. If you'd like to comment on those, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I think already mentioned were 2 levels of coordination that need to happen. First, identifying key suppliers, especially for equipment and energy sources, both to ensure access to key sites and to pre-position resources. However, in addition to that, going back to the goal of maintaining connectivity to reduce loss of life and really thinking about the bigger picture of what some of this means in a disaster situation for end users and more broadly for communities, I think there are three other areas of collaboration worth mentioning. First is coordinating with government bodies, which Mr. Fouet already touched on. But on the one hand, that can mean national emergency telecommunications plans that allow flexible regulations during crisis situations, which is of course a long process, but one worth getting started ahead of a disaster situation to make sure that one can react flexibly in that situation. And the other hand, something that's come up now a few times is early warning systems, because we know that networks can be critical to disseminate information quickly and efficiently, not just to data centers, but to end users. Both of these are complex processes. But a second sort of level of coordination is with humanitarian responders. So making sure that they have consistent access to services and information at key sites. So that might mean working ahead of time to identify where those key sites might be so that operators can prioritize and maintain connectivity. And the third is coordinating with others within the industry. So within telecommunications, I mean mobile network operators, but that might mean resource and information sharing, as we've seen most recently in Ukraine, tower sharing agreements to maintain that connectivity even in times of crisis or when one operator's facilities might be down, really focusing on that end user and making sure that connectivity is maintained and that services have continuity and resilience built in.
Thank you so much. So three things: government bodies, humanitarian responders, and each other is core. Thank you. That's brilliant. And I want to just go back to Mohammed Naveed, just in terms of your view on the collaborative actions that may be required for the adoption of user-centric guarantees and via sort of local, global, national regulatory mechanisms to help us build this resilient system.
I think this is extremely important for the where we have reached now in terms of dependency on the digital infrastructure, including data center and communication networks. This is something that we have seen some progress happening in last few years, especially after the COVID-19 realization by the governments and the authorities that how much dependencies they have for business continuity on the digital infrastructure. But I believe there is a lot of room of improvement out there. Standards are mostly voluntary, and they can be adopted by any organization, any company. They can adopt them. But to enforce them or to have a widespread adoptability, authorities and regulators need to step in, and there will be two kind of collaboration here. One is the local government level, where the governments, they have the authority and they have the jurisdiction. They can go to the operators, they can go to the players, they can tell them that you need to go for third-party audits, then you need to adoption of certain standards so that a minimum level of service availability and standard can be service standard can be ensured for the end user, for the customers. The other is at the global level, where the different regional different regional countries and the global countries, they have to talk to each other. They need to work together to develop a framework where a unified approach can be adopted all the way. Although I think that's second step. The first step, where in the near future I am looking at, and I'm talking to a lot of regulators in different countries as well, where they are trying to adopt the telecommunication standards are already there, and there are most of the countries, they have some sort of telecommunication regulatory authorities who are regulating in one way or another way. But other digital infrastructure, and especially data center regulators, are still a new thing to the many parts of world, and they are still adopting to that. They're still developing. They're still learning that. I believe governments and need to prioritize that. They need to develop teams internally who understand this business, who understand these requirements very well. They need to empower them and fund them to work with different organizations, different authorities across the globe, to understand what are the most suitable standards for their requirements for their business continuity. And then they need to enforce it in the local markets, especially where it comes to third-party services. So enterprise data centers probably can have one way of enforcement, but looking at the cloud providers and co-location provider, it has to be another way where at least some level of resiliency and reliability is audited and certified by the third party, that this data center meets certain requirements in terms of availability, connectivity, and in terms of resiliency. This is something I believe government should not be shy away, should not be stepping back now. They should proactively step into that. They should mandate a certain kind of periodic third-party audits to make sure that what has been certified or what have been attained a couple of years back, the workload changes has not changed those redundancies, as Jack pointed out earlier, and the capacity that is sold by the co-location providers and cloud providers, that capacity exists there. Its overcapacity is not sold. Like the airlines, they oversell their capacities, and once you go onto the airline, you go to the airport, and it's a really busy day, they turn you back that, okay, we don't have a seat for you, so you have to take the next flight, or flight in the afternoon or something like that. I believe these practices are common in data center industry, since most of the users are not using the full capacity in terms of power and cooling and connectivity. So overselling is something that is seen in this industry, and that need to be audited and regulated by the authorities. For example, once this capacity is required, will this capacity be there to serve the businesses?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And in a minute, I'm just going to ask Michael Winterson to give his views on what he's heard from the panelists. But I noticed that Mr. Rajendra Singh, you'd like to make a short intervention. What were your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much. Just two brief points, what Joe was mentioning about connectivity. One is from the regulator's point of view is the flexibility in the spectrum management, because during the disaster time, the traffic at the affected location increases, and operators need extra capacity in the network. And in the World Bank, we are finalizing a report focusing on spectrum management. Within a month or so, it will be available on our website. The second point I wanted to mention, that in cyclone or hurricane-prone areas, if towers can be strengthened, where the government and the operators, they can work together so that they can withstand the higher wind speed, and maybe they can kind of survive those disasters. Just these two brief points. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And finally, Michael, I know you spent a while listening to fellow panelists, and I wonder if you'd like to share some of your thoughts in terms of the challenges we should be highlighting, some of the possible solutions, whether we can identify actionable steps to build resilience. I think we have actually identified quite a few already to build resilience in data centers to these physical risks associated with disasters and climate change. If you'd like to share your thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Thanks, Emma, and actually thanks everybody, because just absolute lots of different ideas being discussed. And in fact, I don't want to list them all out because that would take the same time again. But I think there's a couple of key things that I heard which are really important, starting with the keynote with one of the 5 pillars, which is the issue of awareness. Awareness that digital infrastructure is complex, but we as an industry have always been working on the issues of sustainability and also innovation. I mean, we heard things like Zoe talking about specific changes to cell towers in Turkey to withstand a local geographical problem, which of course Mr. Singh brought up again with cyclone prone areas. So we're constantly innovating, we're constantly looking at risks, and we're constantly defining around them. On top of that, we always, at every layer, the software layer, the cloud layer, the network layer, the data center layer, are always looking at where is the resilience? What happens if all or part of an element is removed from capacity? How do we reroute and how do we build around that at any of those software, network, or infrastructure layers? And everybody touched on that. And in fact, Mr. Fouet actually brought up the point that as we develop 5G and we start deploying more micro data centers, we get into distributed compute capacity, which creates some risk, but also creates yet another way to build resilience into the system. So I think that awareness of the complexity, especially at the government level, of technology, and a certain faith that this industry is built upon the concept of always innovating, always seeking to single points of failure and removing them. We're built that way as an industry because our customers expect it from us. So we build resilience very naturally. And I think the biggest issue I take from this is we also need to remember that as an industry, when we talk about downtime, failure to provide service, we're typically talking about minor incidences that are minutes long, major incidences that are potentially hours long, or crises such as the COVID pandemic, where everybody started working from home and we had to rewire how people did these conferences. And here we are using the same technology, which was literally deployed within days to deal with the COVID global pandemic by a whole variety of network providers, cloud providers, infrastructure providers. The benefit of this is that when you talk about damage to physical infrastructure, like a road or a bridge or an airport, this could take months to solve. And in the meantime, you can use technology as a trusted way to get around it. Someone mentioned the issues in Ukraine. Technology can respond rapidly to crises and issues and help offset the risk that's inherent in other more physical infrastructure like roads, ports, etc. I guess just to really conclude on this, though, Mr. Singh also brought up the issue of using data and measurement, and I'd like to tie that up with Mr. Saeed's comment about the conflicting priorities. We're always being conflicted with making profit because we're private businesses, doing the right thing because we're asked to by society, providing resilience, which sometimes goes against providing sustainability. And it's only through measurement, standards, and data that we can continue to push against all 4 of those limiters. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. I noticed it's we've only got about 7 or 8 minutes to go. I can't see any more questions on the chat other than the one we have actually addressed. So I wonder perhaps if I could invite each panelist, and Michael, I will invite you again as well to finish. Each of you in turn might like to give me a 1 minute, your final thoughts on this, what you'd like to leave with the audience, and what point you'd like to land. I'd like to start with Mr. Mohammed Naveed Saeed, if I could. So your 1 minute final point for the session.
I believe the awareness, this kind of events create awareness, and there's a need in industry to be more collaborative, more open discussions about the resiliency and the steps that can be taken towards that. And then the key takeaways from these kind of sessions is that all the participant and audience can think of their priorities, they can recalibrate themselves, and then they can get back to the right stakeholders and discuss with them if they require more resources, more investment, or more risk assessment, resource availability to do more risk assessment for their data center on a more frequent basis or on a more wider scale. And I believe that's one of the key pillar that has been touched by Mr. Minister in the beginning, and I believe we are participating to that.
Thank you so much. Ms. Zoe Hamilton, would you like to give us your final thoughts?
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the great discussion today. It's been fascinating. I guess the point that I want to land on is once again reiterating the really important role that communications and information play in a disaster situation. And resilience is important not just for the continuity of services, but also for the reduction of loss of life and these bigger societal implications. Today, we're seeing increasingly complex risks and increasingly an interdependent system, which means that we need to build resilience at multiple levels. I think important to reiterate, coordination between actors is absolutely vital. So thinking about critical suppliers, both on the equipment and the energy side, working with governments and regulators effectively, working with responders, and working with each other. So bringing that all together, it's really about assessing the risks and the interdependencies in order to plan ahead of time, and then testing and iterating, because we know that newer risks are emerging all the time. So trying to keep up with those risks, and I'll end there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Zoe. And Mr. Rajendra Singh?
Thank you very much. I think in his opening remarks, Minister mentioned those 4 points which are very relevant about organization, technology, process, and awareness. What I will just add is that this is the era of like kind of convergence, like telecom industry, for example, the mobile operators are moving to telco cloud, and that kind of convergence is taking place, and therefore different stakeholders and previous speakers, they mentioned about it, that we all have to cooperate together and come out with some solution, because that the figure which was given by minister, like every year around $400 billion, we are losing. Somehow that can be minimized, and the losses to the human this thing can be minimum. So let's see how different stakeholders can work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Jacques Fluet, your turn.
Okay, I think what we've highlighted, and it was well discussed during this panel, is that we need to balance everything around resiliency, sustainability, efficiency, performance of the data centers, but also all the local regulations. And we cannot say, and all of this needs to be done in collaboration with the overall ecosystem. What I mean by that is there's the utility provider people, there's the communication service providers, all of even the water providers for that we need also for cooling the data centers. So all of this needs to work together. We cannot have every group independently trying to build and address all of those components by themselves. I think it's more efficient if everybody does it together. So there's going to need to be a lot more integration at one point between, we've talked a little bit about it at the beginning, the microgrids and how the data center can help for the overall power. We're going to see that for also the water utilization. We're going to see that for in case of disaster. This is even more important to coordinate all the priorities of everybody together so that we can save lives and we can provide the communication systems that are required by the first responders and the local authorities.
Brilliant, thank you. And Michael, do you want to finish the roundup for us?
Sure, Emma, thanks a lot. I think the key thing here that's actually already been hit by many of you, which is the opportunities ahead of us to continue to build in whole of system resilience and sustainability is huge. I think all of us as players in technology have always been concerned with efficiency in general, and resilience for our clients. But if we want to take a big one, a big leap to pure sustainability and resilience, we need to be thinking whole of systems, how everything fits together, works together. And that's going to take a new thinking process in the industry.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating session. We're dealing with change at every level, changing business models, changing geopolitical landscapes, changing climate, obviously, changing infrastructure technologies. And this all presents a huge sort of a mishmash combination of risk and opportunities. Awareness has to improve, cooperation has to improve, standards have to evolve. We need to learn, iterate, be proactive. And we have to treat, I think, our data center assets as systems, as fleets, not individual sites. I love that point coming up. And there's a role of regulation to address specific things, but more to build on existing standards to try and ensure adoption and compliance. I think we've covered an enormous amount in the last 90 minutes. As I said, it's been an absolute honour and a pleasure to moderate this session. Thanks are very much due to the Minister for his opening keynote to the session, and very much to our panellists, Mohammed, Zoe, Rajendra, Jacques and Michael. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our audience. And I think bang on time, I will now close the session. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.